My name is Peter Goldmark. I work for Environmental Defense. On the subject of climate, Prime Minister, you were very clear this afternoon on your support for binding limits. That would place you on the eve of the emitters conference on a different course from President Bush, who has resisted binding limits, and seemed to put you more in the camp of the Europeans who are supporting binding limits. Can you talk to us a little bit about what role you plan to play starting Thursday at this conference, and what courses you tend to advocate there?
You know, I do think Canada has somewhat of a middle ground position on this, and I describe it this way. You know, I would share with the United States, and the United States has, President, I should say, assured everybody last night that his process is intended to supplement, to complement the UN process, not to detract from it. That's what he told all the leaders. On the issue of targets, the United States has signed on to statements at the G8 and at APEC that would seem to imply targets, although admittedly they sound like self-described targets as opposed to being part of a binding international regime, and that's where we differ. We do believe that technological change is what's going to solve this problem, but that technological change isn't going to happen in earnest until signals are sent pretty clearly to the market that it must happen on some kind of a realistic timeline. You know, on the one hand, there are some countries that are pushing for a framework that looks like the current framework. I think the deficiencies of that are obvious. If you go for hard caps as the only kind of target, by definition, the only kinds of countries that will sign on are countries that have no population growth and fairly limited economic growth. That's what happened with Kyoto. And then you end up exempting the developed world, and quite frankly, for countries like Canada, and I think the United States and Australia and a number of others, that kind of a framework creates real difficulties. And the upshot is you have what you have with the Kyoto Accord, which is basically now 2/3 of world emissions outside the regime. So I think that we do need binding international targets. I think it's a global problem. I actually don't think we're going to get there just through a series of national targets. I think there has to be an international framework. But those targets have to be described and established in a way that recognize not just poor countries, but different economic circumstances, and so that they can apply to a range of economic conditions.
Well, you've also announced that Canada had joined the Asia-Pacific Initiative.
Yeah.
And so what in that vein, what role?
Well, we had expressed interest in that some time ago. It's, as you know, an organization designed primarily to promote the development and spread of technology to deal with climate change. It's not an organization that you know, that is advocating targets or advocating some particular overall framework. In fairness, it was reported in Canada yesterday, for instance, it was an anti-Kyoto group. That's not really true, because Japan is a member, and Japan is a signatory, and a reasonably successful signatory of the Kyoto Protocol. So it is a group, though, that, as I say, is doing important work, and more importantly, represents 1/2 of global emissions, over 1/2. And my strong view is if you don't get leadership from the United States in the developed world and from China in the developing world, we will not get an effective protocol. On the other hand, if we do have leadership and participation from those two countries, I believe that everyone else will follow. So we want to be in various forums where we can work to make that a possible outcome.
I'm Ted Sorensen from Paul Weiss, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you for your initial remarks outlining the long history of shared values and beliefs between our two countries. We've been told since 9/11 that we are hated for our values and beliefs by Islamists, Chavistas, and others who mean harm to the United States. Canada is not hated. How do you explain this?
Well, I'm trying to think of how to answer that one.
We have a different way of expressing.
Yeah,
you can answer it.
I'm not sure. First of all, yeah, I answer it in French. I'm not sure, in all fairness, that the United States is hated. It's certainly hated in some circles, the United States as a nation. I suspect in the circles where the United States as a nation is genuinely hated, and you mentioned a couple of them, I suspect Canada is equally hated, as are all countries that stand for those values. The American administration, to be frank, is more widely unpopular than the United States itself. But that's ultimately, that's ultimately an issue for American domestic politics. I've always taken the view that Canadian Prime Minister and Canadian government have a responsibility. Canadian Prime Minister has a responsibility to establish a good working relationship with the President of the United States, regardless of political party or regardless of political discourse in either country, and we do our best to work productively with the American administration. Canada is perceived differently. I think Canada is different, but Canada is also perceived differently internationally. You know, Canada has no history anywhere in the world of conquest or domination. It's probably hard to perceive of Canada being in that kind of a position. Canada is also perceived, you know, as a, you know, maybe a less pure model of values than the United States, but a more complex one. We are a bicultural country, which I think gives Canadian political leaders and its foreign policy people a more inherent understanding of the importance of cultural difference in a pluralistic world. We have different social systems, we have different government structures, some of which resonate much better in other parts of the world than the equivalent American model. And in that sense, I think Canada is both a positive and a non-threatening force. And what my government is trying to do is make sure we can use those values to promote positive change in concert with our allies. What I don't want to do is what Canadian governments have sometimes done in the past, which is to stand on the sidelines bragging about our differences, lecturing, and not really accomplishing anything. We want to take a different tack.
My name is Kate Kruger. I'm with the American Jewish World Service, and my question for you, Prime Minister, is a broad one. Do you think that in Canada you're entering the era of minority governments? And if so, what do you think the implications are for Canada projecting and executing a coherent foreign policy? Well,
Canada now has had 2 minority governments in a row. If the various conservative parties had been united over the past 14 years, which they weren't until recently, we would have had minority government over that entire period as well. So I think with the current political alignment, I'm probably not supposed to say this, my election strategist won't like it, but with the current political alignment, I think the possibility of minority government at any election, including one in the near future, would loom very high. Does it affect Canada's foreign policy? You know, in terms of the day-to-day setting of priorities and taking of positions on the world stage, not very directly, because quite frankly, this is largely under executive authority. I may be criticized in Parliament for it, but in most cases, if I can make my case to the Canadian people, I can pursue you know, an aggressive or well-defined foreign policy. And I don't think our government on anything from the Middle East to, you know, to Afghanistan to climate change has had any hesitation in taking well-defined stands and stands that are sometimes highly criticized in Parliament itself. At the same time, I believe, and we're committed as a government to ensuring that when we actually deploy Canadian resources, Canadian troops around the world, that is supported by Parliament. And so, you know, we have a big challenge, obviously, with the deployment in Afghanistan. We've had a lot of casualties, and unfortunately, those who committed us originally to the engagement now see political points in being against it. That said, I guess I believe what a former Canadian leader told me. I believe that when it comes to foreign affairs and global security, this is one area where you do what is right in the long-term interests of the country, your allies, and the world. And that Canadians, whether they agree or disagree with an individual decision, will support a government that it thinks conducts foreign policy in that manner. If they think a government conducts foreign policy not in that manner or has a weak or visionless foreign policy, then you're in trouble. So I will put it this way, that under a minority government, this government's foreign policy will not change, will not be any different than it would be under a majority government.